Good evening. My name is Austin Gergens, and I'm a sophomore here at Hillsdale College. Currently, I'm studying English and psychology, and tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you the speaker. Mr. Byron York is chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner and Fox News contributor. He earned his Bachelor's of Arts from the University of Alabama and his master's degree from the University of Chicago. Mr. York has covered the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, as well as Congress, and each presidential campaign since the year 2000. Formerly White House correspondent for National Review, he has written for numerous publications, including The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, Atlantic Monthly, Foreign Affairs, and The New Republic. Mr. York is a regular guest on television, including Meet the Press, PBS NewsHour, and The Laura Ingraham Show. He is the author of The Vast Left-Wing Conspiracy and an account of liberal activism in the 2004 election. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Byron York.
Thank you very much, and thank you for mentioning my contributions to the Atlantic Monthly. I'm very proud of that. Been a few years. Thank you very much for having me tonight. I was delighted to come to Hillsdale. I gave a speech at a Hillsdale event in Chicago a few years ago, and I went on a cruise a couple of years ago that was just fantastic. But I've never actually been to Hillsdale, and it's just a real pleasure to come to this beautiful, beautiful place. And I was delighted to be asked to discuss political scandals. Now, it says political scandals since 2008, and one of the guests came up to me before dinner and said, "You are going to talk about Bill Clinton, aren't you?" And I said, "Don't you worry, I will." So we're going to go back a little farther than 2008, because I do think that going back 20 years instead of 10 will tell us a lot about today's political battles. I almost view Bill Clinton and Donald Trump as kind of bookends of presidential scandals. If you look at the Clinton years, I mean, there were a lot of scandals, and I loved every one of them. But the two really big ones were a sex scandal and a foreign influence scandal. We hear a lot about more about one than the other. And now Trump is dealing with a foreign influence scandal and the beginnings of a sex scandal as well. So I'm going to talk about those and what the different ways in which they were treated may tell us. But first I need to say a couple of things about the old independent counsel law, because that played a big role in those Clinton scandals. Now, you learned a lot about it today from Professor Marini. This was a post-Watergate reform, the Ethics in Government Act, 1978. Essentially creates a special independent counsel who's like a fourth branch of government. It essentially serves as the research arm of the House Judiciary Committee when it wants to impeach a president. Now, Republicans were really burned by this law in the 1980s with the Iran-Contra affair. There was an independent counsel, his name was Lawrence Walsh. He was extremely political. He stretched out his investigation to last forever. As a matter of fact, the first story I ever wrote for the Wall Street Journal editorial page must have been about 93. And I learned that Lawrence Walsh was still coming to Washington every week and checking into the Watergate Hotel, which is about the most expensive hotel in Washington, and staying in luxury while he still investigated the Iran-Contra scandal. And Ronald Reagan was gone from office, and George H.W. Bush was gone from office, and he was still doing it. I think the title was The Final Paydays of Lawrence Walsh. But it just went on forever. So when the law expired in the early 90s, Republicans said, let it die. It's bad. It is bad news. Let it die. But the Democrats, who apparently thought that this law just existed to target Republicans, said, no. We must extend this law, and they said it in a very self-righteous way. Bill Clinton himself called the independent counsel law, quote, a foundation stone for the trust between the government and our citizens, a force for government integrity and public confidence. And so I will say, knowing what happened after that, it is okay to laugh when you hear what he said. Because the independent counsel law rose up and repeatedly bit him on the backside. There were just tons of independent counsels during his time in office. By the time he finished, there were 7. Most of them are totally forgotten today. Do you remember Donald Smaltz? I didn't either. He was appointed to look into Mike Espy's conduct as the Secretary of Agriculture. Totally forgotten. Do you remember David Barrett? Totally forgotten. He was to look into whether Henry Cisneros, who was the housing secretary, paid off his mistress. So there were these 7 independent counsel investigations, and at the top of the pyramid is Kenneth Starr. Now, he is mostly remembered for the Monica Lewinsky investigation, but a lot of his investigation actually was into Clinton's business dealings. That's how the whole thing got started with Whitewater. Now, you've probably heard many reports and commentary today talking about how Robert Mueller has nailed so many people in the Trump circle, that this investigation is already a big success. Well, he would have a long way to go to match Kenneth Starr, who got 15 convictions, not indictments, 15 convictions or guilty pleas, including Jim and Susan McDougal, who were the president's business partners in the Whitewater venture, Webster Hubbell, who was the Clintons' very close friend and a top Justice Department official, and Jim Guy Tucker, who at the time was the sitting governor of Arkansas. This is not nothing. It was a big deal. But the Clinton scandal I wanted to look at tonight, and the one that I think tells us something about today, is the Clinton scandal that did not get an independent counsel. In the 1990s, a hostile foreign power meddled in our presidential election. There were serious questions about whether one party's candidate, the beneficiary, was complicit in that meddling, or at least looked the other way while it was going on. The candidate fiercely resisted the appointment of an independent counsel to investigate. He won, and finally, with only moderate, tepid media interest, it all faded away. The country, of course, doing the meddling was China, and the presidential candidate was Bill Clinton, who was already in the White House and seeking re-election in 1996. Now, if you look back on the press accounts from this era, it is striking how brazen the players were as they went about the task of funneling Chinese and other foreign donations into the Clinton campaign. I mean, it's just amazing in light of the attention that is given to Russian influence in the 2016 election, how much was going on in 1996. Now, the names have mostly been forgotten. Anybody remember Charlie Tree? Okay, John Huang, Johnny Chung. I see a couple of hands back there. The names are forgotten, but the record remains. So I'm going to talk about just a little of what was going on. Johnny Chung, born in Taiwan, U.S. citizen, prolific Democratic fundraiser. Between 1994 and 1996, he gave $366,000 to the Democratic National Committee and visited the Clinton White House more than 50 times. In 1995, Johnny Chung gave a $50,000 check to the First Lady's Chief of Staff at an event on the White House grounds. Just walked up, gave it to her, and was later asked about this, and his memorable explanation was, quote, "I see the White House is like a subway. You have to put in coins to open the gates." For New Yorkers in the audience, that's in the pre-fare card era. But in 1999, Johnny Chung testified before a House committee. And he said that a few years earlier, during the election campaign, 1996, He met with the head of Chinese military intelligence in the basement of a restaurant in Hong Kong. And that top Chinese spy said this: "We really like your president. We hope to see him reelected. I will give you $300,000 US. You can give it to the president and the Democratic Party." I'm going to read you something from the Los Angeles Times, which did a good job reporting on this back in the 90s. Chung's testimony has provided investigators the first direct link between a senior Chinese government official and illicit foreign contributions that were funneled into Clinton's 1996 re-election effort. It is the strongest evidence that the highest levels of the Chinese government sought to influence the U.S. election process. Does any of that sound familiar with what is going on today? Now, in the great tradition of operators, Johnny Chung ended up taking a lot of money for himself, but some of that money from Chinese military intelligence, that would be the People's Liberation Army, made its way into the Clinton campaign and into other Democratic efforts. Chung also testified that he had also contributed money that came from another officer in the People's Liberation Army and from the son of China's top military commander. He pleaded guilty, that is, Chung pleaded guilty to bank fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy, and was sentenced to probation. Then there was Charlie Tree, who raised $1.2 million in foreign money, for the Clinton Legal Defense Fund. In March 1996, during the campaign, he shows up at the Clinton Defense Fund office in Washington. He has $460,000 in money orders. They are sequentially numbered and filled out with the same handwriting. Nothing suspicious there. He also visited the White House 22 times and pleaded guilty to violating federal election law and was sentenced to probation. Finally, there was John Wong, the Democratic Party fundraiser, raised more than $1.5 million from illegal foreign sources, visited the White House 78 times. He was an agent for an Indonesian businessman whose name was James Riyadi. A Senate committee found that Riyadi had a long-term relationship with Chinese intelligence. Riyadi pleaded guilty to campaign finance violations and was sentenced to probation. As all this news came out in the year after the election, now, this didn't come out until Clinton was safely reelected, there were calls for an independent counsel to investigate. The law was still in effect. The Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, steadfastly refused. The Justice Department dawdled. Nothing got done. The investigation never reached the level it would have had an independent counsel been appointed. Republicans complained and complained and complained, but Reno never gave in. Now, the scandal was news at the time. I'm sure many of you remember it. Some print outlets, like the LA Times, did a good job in uncovering it, but it received far less coverage on television. Several news outlets basically ignored it. You can watch any given hour, at least without a hurricane, on CNN or MSNBC especially, and hear hours and hours and hours of conversation about Trump and Russia. This, not so much. The rhetoric, too, was restrained. I recently did a nexus search, searching various databases to see if anyone had suggested that President Clinton was guilty of treason because of taking all this money from the People's Liberation Army. And no, people didn't do that, and that's a good thing. So that was the Clinton foreign influence scandal, the one that did not get an independent counsel. Compare it to today, to the public discussion of Trump and Russia. And I will leave it to you as to whether you think coverage of Trump and Russia has been as restrained and cautious as it was in 1996, 7, 8, and 9. But I will talk about something about the Trump-Russia affair that I think is really important, and it does tell us something in real contrast to the Clinton foreign influence scandal. That was because I think we might be in new territory with this Trump-Russia matter, and that is because of the conduct of United States intelligence and law enforcement agencies. Now, a few months ago, I took part in a debate in New York City, and the debate was, does the Russia investigation endanger the rule of law? And I was on the side that argued yes. I had a partner also arguing yes, and that was Alan Dershowitz. Now, a few months ago, I would not have guessed that I would have appeared with Professor Dershowitz discussing a weighty topic in a comedy club in Greenwich Village. But those are the times we live in. So, one of the things I said is that if by endanger the rule of law you mean does it destroy our legal order, threaten our democracy, and I think no, I don't think it does. I don't think the Trump-Russia investigation does that. But if you think it means involves our nation's most powerful law enforcement and intelligence agencies in reckless political conduct that undermines our system of elections and the orderly transfer of power, then yes, I think it does, in fact, endanger the rule of law. And I think there are two incidents that we need to look at more closely that point to the danger of overzealous investigators. The first is that the Justice Department used a law called the Logan Act, which bars private Americans from conducting foreign policy as a pretense to pursue an investigation against the incoming Trump team. Now, for those of you who haven't studied this, the Logan Act was passed in 1799 and has never been used to successfully prosecute anybody. No one has even tried since the 19th century. It's by any practical measure dead. And you can look up the legal concept of desuetude, and you'll see what the Logan Act is, which is it's dead. If you pass a law and you don't enforce it for 200 years, you can't just start. And yet, in the summer of 2016, during the campaign, some prominent Democrats began accusing Trump of violating the Logan Act. They said, remember that time when Trump said, Russia, if you're listening, let's see those emails, those Hillary Clinton deleted emails. Some Democrats called for hearings of that. And after the election, they were stunned, they were angry, and they were watching Trump prepare to undo many of Barack Obama's policies. And some of them turned to the Logan Act. One Democratic representative introduced the One President at a Time Act of 2016, which would specifically subject presidents-elect to the Logan Act. I don't know who that could have been about, or presidents-elect to the Logan Act. John Conyers, who was then the top Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, asked the Justice Department to investigate Trump for possibly violating the Logan Act. Now, all of that was just political posturing. That is not a threat to the rule of law. But, unbeknownst to the public, the Obama Justice Department was using the Logan Act as a pretext to take action against the incoming administration. When Intelligence Intercept picked up Michael Flynn, who is the new National Security Advisor, talking to the Russian ambassador in December of 2016, that is, during the transition, the Obama Justice Department saw this as a possible violation of the Logan Act, which it certainly wasn't, because many foreign policy experts saw absolutely nothing wrong with the incoming National Security Advisor talking to a foreign official. Nevertheless, 4 days into the Trump administration, on January 24th, 2017, Sally Yates, who was the holdover Obama official leading the Justice Department, she was the acting Attorney General, she sent agents to the White House to question Flynn, ostensibly on the suspicion that he violated the Logan Act. And it was that interview that ultimately resulted in Flynn pleading guilty of one count of lying to the FBI. The bottom line with that is that the Flynn saga, which is at the very heart of the Trump-Russia investigation, appears to have hinged on a trumped-up suspicion that an incoming, not yet in office administration, had broken a centuries-old law that had never been prosecuted before, when in fact the new administration's real transgression was to make it clear it was going to overturn Barack Obama's policies. Now, the second incident that I think points to the dangers of overzealous investigation is the FBI's use of the Trump dossier. I hope you've all heard of the Trump dossier. It's the Clinton campaign Oppo research product. The FBI used it as part of its counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign. We know that to compile the dossier, a Democratic law firm hired the opposition research group Fusion GPS, who then hired Christopher Steele, that former British spy, who paid a number of Russian collectors, he called them collectors, who then talked to other Russians who provided gossip allegedly about Trump. Most spectacular gossip in that dossier, of course, was the description of Trump in a Moscow hotel room in 2013, watching as prostitutes carried out a kinky sex scene. So Steele takes this material to the FBI, and in a development that I think is still astonishing, the Bureau agrees to pay Steele to keep doing the work, keep gathering dirt on Trump. This is at the height of the 2016 campaign. Even though this deal falls through, the FBI still incorporates the dossier into its Trump-Russia investigation. We all know how they used it to get a wiretap warrant on Carter Page. But in the transition, one of the more stunning scenes of the whole Trump era took place. Early January 2017, Trump is president-elect. The intelligence chiefs, James Comey, John Brennan, Mike Rogers, James Clapper, they traveled to Trump Tower to brief the president-elect on their report about Russian efforts to interfere with the 2016 campaign, which are real, really happened. After the briefing, they have devised a plan by which 3 of them will leave and James Comey will stay one-on-one with Trump. And Trump tells, once they're alone, Trump tells Comey about the Moscow sex scene. We had earlier had reports that said Comey told Trump about the whole dossier. It didn't happen. Comey later said, no, we just talked about the hotel thing. So you imagine this, the very first time the incoming president met the FBI director face to face, the FBI's message was, we know about you and those hookers in Russia, which is, it's kind of astonishing. It's a very J. Edgar Hoover-ish. There's a book called Russian Roulette. Authors are David Korn and Michael Isikoff. They report that Trump immediately felt the FBI was blackmailing him. Trump had seen this sort of thing before, they wrote. Certainly his mentor, Roy Cohn, knew how this worked. So did Comey's famous predecessor, J. Edgar Hoover, who quietly let it be known to politicians that he possessed information that could destroy their careers. How could Trump think otherwise when he gets this briefing? Amazingly enough, the briefing of Trump soon leaks to the media. And it was the fact that top officials had seen fit to brief the incoming president about the dossier that made this a story. They legitimized it and turned it into a story by having this briefing. Within hours, the website BuzzFeed published the whole dossier on the internet. Voila, it's all out in public. Remember that Charles Schumer, the Democratic leader in the Senate, said, as this was happening, he said, you take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you. So, with the Logan Act, Obama holdovers used a dead law as a pretense to push the Trump investigation. With the dossier, they used unverified Oppo research not only to investigate the Trump campaign, but to execute a clever maneuver to make it all public. And this was all done by the nation's top law enforcement and intelligence officials targeting a new president. That is troubling. And so if you look at the Clinton foreign influence campaign, and you look at the Trump foreign influence investigation, you see very, very different things. You see sluggish law enforcement in one. You see overzealous law enforcement in the other. you see a largely uninterested media in one, and you see a fixated media in the other. So those are bookends of political scandal in Washington for the last 20 years, although there are many, many others. And I would be happy to take your questions on any of those or any other subject you might want to bring up. But thank you very much for inviting me this evening. So I think there is some way to ask questions. Will there be microphones? I'm looking for help here. No?
Raise your hand and the mic will be brought to you.
There we go. There we go, right here.
Do you foresee any
Oops. Hold on just a second.
Do you foresee any Comey bombshells before the election?
You know, the thing is that I think everybody, when they discuss the whole Mueller investigation, should be modest and cautious because it has produced stuff that we didn't know before. Whenever we find there's a news report of some sort of new aspect, I don't know, something that Michael Cohen did or whatever, Mueller knew about it 6 months ago. So everything I write, I am cautious to say we don't know, there could be something else. But I have been kind of on the lookout for moving the goalposts on the issue of collusion because I always thought the issue of collusion was the heart of this whole thing. And we do know for a fact that a number of people in the Trump circle have been charged with crimes, and they've either pleaded or, in the case of Manafort, been convicted. And none of those crimes involve collusion or conspiracy. Michael Flynn, well, let's say this. Try to think of a conspiracy with the Russians that Flynn, Manafort, Gates didn't know about, weren't part of. And yet Michael Flynn has pleaded guilty to lying about to the FBI, nothing about collusion. The Manafort, it's about a lot of financial dirty dealing, none of it about collusion, none of it about the campaign, really. Richard Gates, Manafort's deputy, the same sort of thing. For that matter, George Papadopoulos, who just got sentenced to 14 days in prison. Again, nothing about this collusion. So a number of people who were prosecutors, who followed these sort of things very closely, believe that at some point, if Mueller were going to pursue this, he would have laid out the scheme that he believes occurred and made somebody plead guilty to playing some role in it. On the other hand, I can't predict the future. I don't know. Mueller's got a lot of lawyers. They're talented. They're aggressive. They seem motivated. So we can't say. Over here.
What news sources do you consider to be credible, and what news sources would you go to?
Well, first of all, I try to listen to all of them for one reason or another. I was telling John Miller's class today that whenever I can, I like to just look at a primary source. So if I see that there's a new poll, and the Washington Post has a big headline, new poll shows Trump at historic low, I don't read the article. I just go to the poll because that's what the internet is for. It can show you the whole thing, and I look at it. I do that with every poll story. I never read the write-ups of polls. Some people you follow because you know they know something about what you're interested in. Now, on the stuff that I have been writing about the whole the behavior of the Justice Department and the intelligence agencies and the Trump-Russia investigation, there's about 5 people who were doing it. There's Molly Hemingway, Kim Strassel, Andy McCarthy, Chuck Ross, and me. Not a lot of people, but when they write something, I look at it. Now, on the other hand, every day I often drive down to Fox to appear on a special report in the 6 p.m. hour, and so I will listen to CNN at 5, or I'll listen to Chuck Todd at 5, because I need to know what they're saying. I need to know what's being said. So I think it's extremely important to listen to all of them, even if, just for a brief period. But I certainly look at all of the mainstream outlets. Okay.
Bob McGregor, thank you very much for your presentation. Recently, I heard Democratic Senators Durbin and others brag about Obama's scandal-free administration, and Obama spoke last week about his scandal-free administration. Can you comment on that, please?
That's what they said. Well, look, I think I was not a huge follower of Fast and Furious, which I see was featured in one of our graphics on screen tonight. That was clearly a problem, and I think the behavior, the actions of the Obama IRS were absolutely outrageous, and I think that was clearly scandalous. And Obama did other things that never rose to the level of scandal or even much news coverage, but he would, for example, the Justice Department Civil Rights Division would pursue discrimination cases against, say, the owner of an apartment building who did not rent equally to all people. And they'd have to pay a fine, and Obama began steering them to activist groups. Hadn't happened before. Usually to pay a fine or to pay restitution, you'd have to have a victim and then pay them. Obama did all sorts of changes like this that just didn't get much news coverage. And before that, the Bush administration, those were mostly political. I mean, there were huge political battles, and Democrats accused George W. Bush of lying the country into war in Iraq, or of instituting torture in U.S. intelligence interrogations. There was all sorts of talk like that. But this sort of scandal thing, I think we have not seen, the sort of full court press, we have not seen since the Clinton years. And in the Clinton years, what was interesting, and I didn't talk about Lewinsky a lot. Well, what happened in the Lewinsky years, of course, was, I believe the scandal broke in January of '98. And not long after that, a lot of the press began to turn on the prosecutor. They began to turn against the prosecutor. Remember all this Inspector Javert thing. Kenneth Starr is chasing sexual misdeeds and all of this stuff. It's just an entirely different media atmosphere, and it's not going to change. I mean, if the Mueller investigation ends without finding any sort of collusion or conspiracy, they're just going on to something else. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'd like to know why there's basically no reporting except for maybe one journalist on the M1 Iran house computer scandal, and what's your take on that?
That is a great question, and I feel guilt about that because I don't really cover it very much, and once you've let a story get so advanced, it's hard to catch up. And I know you're referring to Luke Rosiak, I think, at the Daily Caller, who covered it a lot. And the behavior of Nancy Pelosi was really, really, let's just call it inexplicable in this whole thing, to essentially threaten Capitol Police if they investigated laptops that these guys had used. They had access to, being IT guys in the House of Representatives, they had access to an enormous number of lawmakers' data. And that is a great question of why it didn't catch on. And I mean, you understand why it didn't catch on in the mainstream press. But I have to say, speaking, it didn't catch on really in National Review or the Weekly Standard or the Washington Examiner or any of these places. Fox News, I think, covered it well. But I wish I could give you an answer. You can tell I'm kind of tap dancing. I don't really know. So, sorry. We missed that one. Let's see, where's the microphone?
To the speaker's left.
Okay. Oh,
Hi.
Hi.
Chloe Kersey. So a few days ago, Obama began speaking openly again about Benghazi. So how do we see a man go from calling himself a scandal-free 8 years in office to perpetuating a scandal and reopening the wound that is still so heavy on many Americans' hearts just days before 9/11?
That was extraordinary. Well, I think that Democrats feel a lot of resentment over Benghazi. They think that Obama did absolutely nothing wrong, and that this was a case of Republicans just torturing them and making Hillary Clinton testify for 11 hours and all of that stuff. That was a case in which clearly the thing that was, there were two big scandals in that, I thought, which was, one, the unpreparedness of the Obama administration with security in Benghazi, where you basically have experienced diplomats kind of jumping up and down and waving their hands saying, this is a problem, we're in trouble, we're in danger, we need help, and they get nothing. And then when there is an attack, there's the question of did U.S. forces just drop everything and do everything they could? I'm not saying they could have gotten there in time to do that, but at the time these Americans were killed in Benghazi, were forces on their way, were forces busting everything they could to get there. And I think Trey Gowdy, leader of the Benghazi committee, discovered that they didn't. But I believe that in most places in the press view Benghazi as an example of Republican overreach. And so Obama knows that it is absolutely, totally, 100% safe to talk about it. So you'll probably hear more. Okay.
Hey there, thank you so much for your talk. I really appreciate it. I am a sophomore here, and I am very interested in writing. And one of the things I've been thinking about with your talk is that it's incredibly frustrating to watch the liberal media constantly spinning stories and feeling like the majority of the media doesn't express what the majority of the people of America are thinking. So my question to you is, do you see any ways that, say, a young writer or just conservative media in general can take it to the next level and get what we want to share into the hands of the American people? How can we make it more persuasive or a new tactic, or what do you think?
Well, thank you for your question. And what I told John's class today is what I believe, which is they're all going to go out, and many of them are going to want to get into journalism. I really, really, really believe they should try to get jobs in mainstream outlets. And my early years in this were at CNN, and then at an ABC station in Miami, and then at an NBC-owned and operated station in Washington. That was when I was doing television. And these were all mainstream outlets. And when I was working at NBC, I operated under the standards that NBC had. And I didn't decide that they were doing it all wrong, and I was going to do it some way else. I thought it was very important to work in that atmosphere. And when I started to want to write stuff from a different point of view, I wrote it at different places, and after a while, like the American Spectator and National Review and the Wall Street Journal, and after a while, my sideline began to outweigh my main job, so I quit TV and began writing. And but I think it's important to get that experience with a mainstream outlet, whether it's a newspaper in Michigan or anywhere else. I think it's really important, and then afterwards you can move on. But I wouldn't just jump into conservative media immediately. I think it'd be better to get that experience before you do it. You'll have, you'll get more experience doing it according to those standards, and it will come in very handy for you later on.
Oh. Hi. Thank you for coming. I had to look something up so I could ask it correctly. There was briefly reported, and I know the media didn't dwell on this, but I think it was really, really important to everything that happened with the Justice Department in the last 2 years, is when James Clapper and Loretta Lynch signed off on a modification of Executive Order 12333, signals intelligence sharing amongst agencies, which looks like the last several paragraphs talk about unmasking. They called it USPI.
Yeah.
And wasn't that sort of their superficial justification for what they were doing?
Yeah, well, we know, we certainly know that they unmasked Michael Flynn when he was caught in a intercept talking to the Russian ambassador. And it was interesting, the unmasking scandal, which we don't know enough about. And you saw the pushback against Representative Devin Nunes was just huge. He was just a White House water boy, and then he made up this crazy thing about unmasking, and yet it appears that there was a lot more unmasking going on during the transition than when the Obama administration was still in power, than we knew about beforehand. And we still need to know about that. And I'm going to make a more general point now. Whatever we learn from Republicans in the House and the Senate in the next 2 months in the House could be the last for a while if Republicans don't win control of the House. If Democrats win control of the House, Adam Schiff will be the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Gerald Nadler will be the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and Elijah Cummings will be the chairman of the House Government Oversight Committee. So it's true. And so that could happen. So I would really like to see more about unmasking, because I think it's one of these loose ends just hanging out there that we have learned more about the dossier, and I think we're going to learn more in the next couple of weeks, maybe tomorrow. But this is something we need to know more about. That's a great question.
End of December of 2016 and then beginning of January 2017, and that was really never done.
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Sorry. Oops. Oh, it was. Is this still being done? She said, and presumably, the Trump administration has most of its own people in these positions now.
Hi, I'm
Might
Nancy.
be a big presumption.
I'm going to ask you, there's a problem with the declassification of emails that Trump won't allow.
Yeah.
And we all maybe have the worst theory about that they have something on them. And because I don't see any other explanation that he won't.
Okay. Well, the reason I said maybe tomorrow is that he might declassify some stuff tomorrow or this week. But I'll give you just a quick rundown of that. Earlier this year, there was the so-called Nunes memo, and it was just that 4 or 5 pages that Nunes compiled, and it did show definitively that the FBI had used the dossier to get a wiretap on Carter Flynn and all of that, Carter Page. And Trump declassified it. You know, there were these, Nunes wanted to make it public, goes to the Justice Department, and they just scream that people will die and sources and methods will be endangered and blah, blah, blah. It was just not true. And so finally, the president declassified it. Now there are three things that Nunes would like to see declassified, and Republicans have been asking for months for Trump to do this. They are the remaining portions of the Carter Page FISA application, which allegedly tell us a lot more about what the FBI used. They are we're deep in the weeds here, but maybe some of you follow this. They're the 302 interviews that Bruce Orr gave to the FBI. No reason those should be classified. And then there's some additional papers they want done. But and why is Trump doing this? There has been a debate inside the White House between people who are making legitimate points about this is the kind of stuff that's never been declassified before. We shouldn't declassify it. It's actually not really true. A lot of these things have been declassified before. And some of them shouldn't be secret to begin with. Think about the Comey memos, these memos that James Comey writes after each interaction with Donald Trump beginning in January 7th with the transition. Comey writes these, then he shares them with some people at the FBI, then he leaks them to the New York Times for the purpose of being published, setting off an uproar, and then resulting in the introduction of a special counsel, the appointment of a special counsel, a plan that works. Immediately after the New York Times report comes out, Congress says, wait a minute, we want to see these. The chairman, the Republican, and the ranking member, the Democrat, of the the Senate Judiciary Committee, which has direct oversight over the Justice Department, said, give us those memos. And Justice Department said, no, you can't see them. They treated them like they were super duper top nuclear code secrets. And later, when they did allow it, they allowed one member to come into a room with an FBI minder standing there, no copies allowed, no note-taking allowed, no nothing, look at them and then leave. And only when James Comey writes a book based on the memos and starts going out with a publicity tour to talk about them, the Justice Department is still protecting them like they're the nuclear codes, and Comey is doing, Stephen Colbert talking about them. And finally, the Justice Department lets them go, and you've got all 7 of them, and you think, why were these secret? They didn't have to be secret. A lot of this stuff is like this. There's far too much secrecy in this, and what it allows is somebody who has these memos in the Justice Department can leak a line or two from them, can get a story with a particular spin in a major news outlet. Nobody has seen the whole thing in the public, and nobody can evaluate, is that really the story? Is that the right story? Does the rest of the memo say just the opposite? We don't know that. So there's way, way too much secrecy here, both in classification, things that are classified that should not be, and in just plain secrecy, where the Justice Department says, no, you can't see it. So I think we're going to see more from the president, but each time he does it, it is really like pulling teeth.
So many questions to ask. But I'll ask Nolan, what is your take or evaluation on Jeff Sessions?
Should I get a show of hands here? Well, Sessions really rendered a lot of service to the president. He was the first senator to support him. He offered unbelievable counsel and knowledge to the campaign, extremely valuable. I was telling this story at my table tonight. I'll say it. It's kind of apropos of nothing, but on election night, most of the Trump people did not think they were going to win. So we're at the Hilton in Midtown Manhattan on election night, and I see Sessions about 6 o'clock, and we chat, And there's almost kind of an elegiac tone to what he is saying. He's saying, you know, this campaign, we really brought up a lot of issues that needed to be discussed in this country, and we're really proud of that. It was like the undertone was, well, we lost, but we really did some good things. Okay. See him about an hour later, he's in a slightly better mood. Still, not totally changed. So I see him about 9 or 9:30. You know that thing that was on the New York Times website? It was a meter, and it showed what chances Trump had of winning the presidency, and it started out that night at 2%, right? So I see him at 9:30, and he's bouncing. He comes up and he says, somebody told me the New York Times says Trump has a 53% chance of winning. And I said, it's more than that. So I pull out my phone and I called it up. I said, Senator, 89% chance of winning. And he goes, 89%? I'm telling you, the Lord is at work tonight. The story, alas, does not have a happy ending. So look, he wanted to be Attorney General. He had spent a career in the Justice Department, and is doing, probably of all the cabinet secretaries, is probably implementing a Trumpian agenda at the Justice Department more than any other cabinet secretary at any other department is doing. But he recused himself from Russia. He firmly believes it was the right thing. It was the only thing he could do. He wasn't right or wrong. This was absolutely required by Justice Department regulations. He was advised by people who were on his side, not just Obama holdovers or anything like that. But it made Trump believe that he was weak. And Trump would say to him, Jeff is weak, that's it. And when Trump thinks you're weak, you're dead. And he hasn't been able to fire Sessions because certainly last year, Charles Grassley, that we've talked about, the Senate Judiciary Committee, Grassley is the chairman and basically said to Trump, if you want a new attorney general, you'll have to have one confirmed by us. And I don't think we've got the time right now. We just don't want to do it. And I mean, he brushed Trump back in a pretty big way. And so Sessions stayed in. Everybody thinks that he'll leave after the midterms. But the one thing I will say about Sessions is, I don't think he was completely wrong in recusing, but it was something that Trump found unforgivable. But otherwise, Sessions has really instituted a very Trumpian agenda. And maybe someday, when he's gone, Sessions is gone, someone will write about that. Maybe someone who has a column or something will write about that. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Byron York, for appearing here at Hillsdale and enlightening us on a lot of the issues about what's happening today. My question is very simple. Donald Trump is being investigated for collusion with the Russians. Now, is this a federal crime under some statute that I don't know about? Or is it tempest in a teapot? Or is it a nothing burger?
Well,
and if so, why are we giving it all this attention?
Well, you make the right point that there is no crime called collusion, and you can go back and look in the general press conversation. When did the words of collusion start? Actually, it was somebody in the Washington Examiner. It wasn't me, but one of our writers mentioned it pretty early on in the investigation, and it kind of stuck. So there is no crime called collusion, but there is. If you look at Mueller's assignment, it says he's to look into any conspiracy between the Russia and members of the Trump campaign. So collusion is just a casual word for it, and it's a perfectly fine word for it. And I'll just go back to what I said earlier, which is that we don't know what Mueller is going to do, but we do know what he has done. And he has charged people who one would think would be involved in Russian collusion if such a thing had occurred. and he hasn't charged them with it. So we'll see. I think what you saw with the outbreak of the Stormy Daniels affair plus the Michael Cohen thing, I think certainly the day that Michael Cohen pleaded guilty, I think a lot of the press just turned on a dime. And all of a sudden it was campaign finance violations. Trump has committed a felony in offering a thing of value to Stormy, or having Cohen offer a thing of value to his campaign, $130,000 payoff, and that's a felony. So I think that if many people in the press had their way, they would just do a 180 from collusion on to Stormy Daniels and on to Michael Cohen. I think it's important to keep in mind what the original accusation was, how serious it was, because I mentioned the word treason before. You hear it a lot in connection with Russia. And if it doesn't come to anything, I think a lot of people should point that out.
We have time for one more question to
One
the
more?
speakers left.
Okay.
Thank you for your comments tonight, sir. What is your view on the anonymously published publications recently, and what do you see happening in the future with the gates open in that field now?
With the what?
With the gates open with the acceptance of anonymous publications?
You know, I don't blame the New York Times for publishing this. I blame Anonymous for writing it. But look, it's a New York Times editorial page. We know where they stand. And if somebody comes up and says, I'm an official in the Trump administration and I want to dump all over Trump, they're going to give him the space to do it. It's unusual that they would grant anonymity to him. And I think that a lot of people, and not just people who support the president, are deeply concerned about the prospect of some unelected staff taking it upon themselves to make presidential level decisions on what documents should be signed, what policies should be enacted, and what should not be enacted. Absolutely unelected, not even confirmed by the Senate staff, doing this. I think it's a very concerning thing. What's driving the story right now is the anonymity, because the anonymity gives it a sense of excitement. It gives it a sense of possibility. Who is it? Is it Mike Pence? Is it Nikki Haley? Who knows? You have all these names thrown around, crazy names. But that's what gives it, the story, its sexiness. And if we found out who it is, let's say we found out it's the senior director for Near Asian Affairs in the National Security Council, who has the word senior in his title, but nobody's ever heard of him, then you can look at that person and you say, well, what's their background? What do they do? What's their motive? What policies have they thwarted on the part of the president? What's going on here? The story would get bogged down in details. You would find actually what was going on, and this guy might not look so heroic as he does to some people on the left right now. So it's the anonymity that's driving this, which makes me begin to wonder whether there are some people in the press who don't want to know who it is. But it's a really bad thing. It's another sort of violation of a norm that we've seen. That phrase is used a lot in connection with the Trump years. But it's a bad thing, and I have to tell you, we're not far before an election right now, but then after that it's going to be all presidential re-election. So I think that it's inevitable that you'll see more stuff like this that you probably can't even think of right now. So on that happy note, I want to say thank you very much for having me tonight.